Three, two, one. Yeah, we're live. So, to kick off the discussion, could you tell me a little bit about yourself, your background and relation to AI or open education?
Sure. So I guess my background related to this topic would be that I did PhD at the Open University as a part of the Open World Learning program. It was funded by the Leverhulme Trust. And in that work, we were exploring, in this day and age where we have so many free online educational resources, why is it that those that could benefit the most from them are not appearing to be the ones that are, that it feels like people that are already successful in education are taking advantage of all of these wonderful free resources, when those that could potentially benefit the most are not pursuing it as much. And so the Open World Learning Program was investigating that across, I think, 18 different PhDs, of which I was one. My work was particularly looking at the role of emotions in online collaboration and communication, trying to understand how we might better amp up signal of emotional communication. So in my thesis work, I was looking at emotional measurements, for which machine learning was one of the applications. Particularly opinion mining was something that I was looking at in contexts of highly international student body. So I have some experience in open and some experience in machine learning, and some like reachings towards artificial intelligence, which I pursued further in my postdoc at MIT, when I was looking at AI and teacher preparation for computer science teachers in K-12 classrooms. And I was working with teachers to basically build on an extensible AI platform to generate interpretations of vocal expressions. Particularly, I was investigating the ability to detect and respond to expressions of confusion in audio recorded responses. So that would be sort of my backgrounds related to openness and my backgrounds related to artificial intelligence.
Okay, I see. And at the moment, what's your current role or job title?
Yeah, so I'm currently the Learning Initiatives Director at ERDIF, which is the Advanced Education Research and Development Fund. We launch R&D programs that are funded in the tens of millions of dollars. And in my current work, I support the potential new executive directors for programs at ERDIF and the development of their concepts, and of which, like, I've been working with a cohort of 10 potential new directors on their concepts, and all of them have some relationship with AI in their proposals. So there's some level of discussions around what the future of education might look like. At ERDIF, we focus on addressing issues of equity that disproportionately affects Black students, Latino students, and students experiencing poverty in the American K-12 system. And so we're looking at different R&D programs that might make a material difference, looking at like the long-term, like next 20-year trajectory of what direction we'd like the US to head in terms of its education system.
All right. And Rob's joined us too. Hello, Rob.
Hello, hi, how's it going?
I am going to leave us here if that's all right, as I'm heading off to another meeting. But if you can take over, I
Yep.
haven't started asking anything about AI or open education yet.
Okay, cool, thanks. So for today, obviously Vid's explained the setup to you and gone through the consent and stuff like that. I've got a list of questions to work through, but it's more to make sure we cover everything rather than we have to just do them sort of as a sequence of questions.
Sure.
So we can talk around a bit of stuff and explore a few, ideas as we go. So the first question, I think you've already had, which is about explaining your current role and your job at the moment. So if that one's done, I'll move on to the next prompt, which is about AI. And the question is really, like, what do you understand by AI? What's your experience of using AI technologies? And just tell us a bit more about your perspective on artificial intelligence, please.
Sure. So, I think artificial intelligence is primarily, just explicitly trying to create some form of intelligence with machines as opposed to sort of like humans, right? And I think that there's been like an earlier stage in AI work where I feel like there was a lot of direct connection between how do we model how human brains work and how do we get computers to do something similar or related to that. And I really feel like we're moving into a space where we're really recognizing that it's really related but different, and that what machines are capable of and what they do is kind of different than what people do. And I think we're exploring our understanding of that sort of coexistence between like what computers and machines have a capacity for and what people have a capacity for, and how we can coordinate what each brings to the table in sort of addressing and tackling the challenges that we face as a society. That's sort of how I see AI right now. My personal experience with it, I'd say again, I've done probably more on the machine learning side than on the AI side, sort of looking at different ways of detecting and parsing information. And I felt shy of getting to sort of like production quality predictors that could then inform strategic responses in my own personal work. And I feel like it's, if you think about it just from like a human brain perspective, there's the perception of information, the sort of memory storage, and then the strategic prefrontal cortex, like decision making that people make. I feel like in my own work on the technology side, I don't feel like I pushed into that strategic decision making piece very far. But I do think I spent a fair amount of time looking at like emotional interpretation of content. So sort of that amygdala, like the components of sort of, however you want to view emotion and its role in our process of intelligence. I did spend some time looking at emotional measurement and how we might design systems to support sort of emotional experiences.
And this is part of your PhD, right?
Yeah, both my PhD and my postdoc. In my PhD, it was really text analysis, and in my postdoc, it was vocal analysis. But always curious about what we could possibly perceive on the emotional dimension, which is a little bit harder than I thought it would be. So, yeah.
So slight sidebar, but the link with AI then and the kind of emotional analytics stuff, is it in using machine learning to try to sort of decipher emotional states from certain cues like facial expressions or typing speed or stuff like that?
Yeah, so in the work that I did on emotional measurement in text, and my thesis was particularly keen to understand. Some people refer to the detection of emotional expression in text as opinion mining. But far frequently, the foundations of opinion mining is a handful of researchers computing their inter-rater reliability, all looking at each other and nodding and saying, that looks like a positive comment. And the question in my thesis was, if we're really mining opinions, shouldn't we ask the students what their opinions are and compare that to the predictions? And so I collected a bunch of data on student opinions of what emotional content was being expressed. And then I looked at a bunch of out-of-the-box like machine learning technologies that would make predictions about opinions within text. And I found that they didn't line up very well. In fact, they lined up so poorly that I pivoted and decided to try to create my own predictions of emotional expression based on student opinions as the ground truth, as opposed to high levels of inter-rater reliability and researchers coding the data themselves, and really trying to center the student opinions. And then I found in my thesis work that like a cohort of students were better at predicting or generating a classifier of emotional communication for the next year's cohort. So if I, imagine this year you collect a bunch of data from students on their opinions, and then you generate a classifier, and then next year you say about the similar conversations. That seemed to do better than a lot of the out-of-the-box technologies where they had been trained by sort of researchers looking at their inter-rater reliabilities. So there are some context potential factors, both in like the domain of learning, as many of these predictors weren't built in the context of learning, and then there's also the context of like the particular population that university attracted, and sort of what those context factors were playing a role. But I think there is something to centering the students themselves as we think about making predictions about students, as we sort of build that truth that that sort of ground truth that all of these predictors really hinge on.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff. We should progress through the protocol that we've got today, but we'll come back and maybe touch on some of these things again. So that's from the AI side. What about from this sort of more open education side? What's your experience of open education? What do you understand by open education?
Yeah, so when I think about open education, I think about there's a whole host of efforts that I would put in the umbrella of open education. And I think that in that umbrella, I would think of open educational resources. I would think about things like open educational practices. I would think about sort of open student data sets. Like I would be thinking about a whole range of things that fall under the umbrella of open. And I think that the thing that I hold as an opinion on openness is that there's openness is a necessary but not a sufficient condition of inclusion. And I feel like, you know, when I think about open education, I think about it as the foundations of inclusion. And in part of that is informed by the work that I've done on accessibility and sort of assistive technologies in education. That, you know, if you think about openness just as plainly and as simply as an open door, that anyone could possibly walk through, then you need to ask questions like, well, is there a staircase in front of that door? And are there people that might have a hard time going up that staircase? Maybe if there was a ramp, more people would make it through the door. And by the way, where is that door? So, you know, I always, when I talk openness, I always talk about the Douglas Adams example, where the earth is being demolished. And they're like, you know, the plans to demolish the Earth have been publicly available for 50 years. It's like, well, yeah, great. They're over on Alpha Centauri, and who on Earth had a chance to even go there? And that's it's a whimsical example, but in a lot of realities, that's not far-fetched. Like things that we claim to be open are sometimes so distant and so remote from either physically or conceptually from people that we're trying to reach, that the openness is not sufficient in its own nature. It's a necessary condition, but it's not sufficient. And that inclusion, where you say, wait a minute, the staircase is preventing someone, say, in a wheelchair from getting through the front door. Maybe if we made a ramp, more people could come through. And so as I think about open education, I always think about what are the inclusion moves that are necessary for open education to sort of realize its potential.
Okay, thank you. So now we're going to try and put the two concepts together. And I'm going to ask you, how would you understand or define the concept of openness within the context of AI?
Yeah, so I think there's something to be said in openness with AI around how we can possibly get the range of sort of perspectives into the conversation of the application of AI in education. And I think that there's a whole host of people with deep expertise and deep wells of knowledge around the field of education. And in fact, I think education is one of those places where like literally everyone has an opinion because they've all personally had their own educational experiences. And then some study it, and then some like teach it, and some support it, and some, you know, build products for it. So there's a litany of opinions out there in terms of the education system. And I think that AI work is a work that relies on sort of like complex technologies, and to which people have varying degrees of understanding and ability to engage in sort of like, where are the fruitful conversations, where are the places where those opinions need to be heard, and how are those opinions connected into the conversation is a question that I have for open AI or openness in AI in education. So effectively, my curiosity around it is, it's almost like, how do you get the range of perspectives integrated into conversation to advance the applications of advanced technologies in learning and teaching, knowing that there are some hurdles that you need to sort of compass, and going back to the example of like a staircase in front of an open door, I feel like there are, metaphorical staircases that people are faced with as they approach open in AI and education, that we need to think about. Does it need to be a staircase? Should it be a ramp? And if it needs to be a ramp, what does a ramp mean? Sort of extending that metaphor into a practical reality. I can share that I did a fellowship for teacher preparation programs for professors that were preparing teachers on the topic of teaching computer science, and I supported them to author, implement, and research their own simulation-based learning activities in an AI extensible platform. And so there was a lot of work that was done in connecting people and identifying what are the barriers for you in sort of conducting your own AI research, and what could we do systematically to sort of like remove those barriers and get you into the conversation and get your perspective integrated into exploring what the potential for AI and teaching and learning could be. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. And I don't want to put words in your mouth, but harking back to your previous answer where you were talking about openness, it sounds like you're kind of referring mainly to an idea of inclusion in this, and it could be like inclusion with the technology, but also inclusion in the conversation as well. Does that?
Yeah. So yeah. So totally. And I apologize. Actually, I don't apologize for pushing back on the centering of openness to rather the centering of inclusion, because I feel like there's as we think about AI and education and sort of the openness, like the things that I'd like to be open is I'd like to be opening up questions of what is the research agenda that we need to be looking at? What are the questions that we need to be answering? I mean, just in plain language, what questions do we have about what AI can do in the context of teaching and learning? And what I don't want to see is I don't want to see a lack of inclusion preventing access from open resources that help us explore the possibilities of AI in teaching and learning. And so effectively, there's a need to identify how do we get more voices at the very front of the conversation about even framing the questions that we should be asking. And as we get more voices integrated into the conversation of what questions we need to be asking about AI in education, that's when we're realizing the potential of openness of AI in education. And I think there's some work to be done in that inclusion process so that we can realize the potential of openness.
And are there any sort of specific tools or technologies or platforms that you would say either meet this kind of idea of openness in AI or show some potential towards it? Like, how do you see that? Or do you think it's not really about that? It's more about practice and, as you say, discourse?
I feel like we're exploring what that should look like right now. I don't think that I have great exemplars of tools. I mean, I can share that there was a platform that I was working on in my postdoc at MIT called Teacher Moments that sort of let people author, implement, and research their own investigations, generate their own classifiers, and build some responses to that. But I don't think that's anywhere. That was a prototype. I don't feel like that's sufficient for the sort of scale of inclusion that I'd like to see. I feel like there are people that are advancing public discourse on the topic that I think is critical in sort of like connecting with the level of inclusion that I'd like to see to support the benefits of open AI in education. But I feel like right now, one of the challenges that we face is that with sort of advanced technical approaches, they frequently require some form of like revenue streams or funding that are frequently driven by market forces. And those markets tend to grant access to people that have the ability to pay to play. And so from my perspective, I think that we're seeing at the onset of this effort, something looks very characteristic to other advances in technology, where venture capitalists make investments in products based on an investment thesis, and then those products have markets where people have a capacity to pay for them, and then the people that have the capacity to pay are in the conversation, and those that don't are not in the conversation. So I feel like, when we think about the existing platforms, I think we're seeing early movement in a way that feels very parallel to other advances of technology in education. I don't think
Thanks.
that's the only way forward. I think there are other efforts that are in play. Obviously, the work that you're doing with open education, the work that I'm doing over at AirDiff on like sort of inclusive R&D. I think there are small little efforts, and by small I mean actually quite substantial efforts, but they still feel a little pocketed
Well, they're
around the
certainly
world.
small by comparison to venture capitalists, right?
Right. And so I feel like there's a question for me in, when there are institutions that are entering that space that maybe don't have the same sort of, market-driven resources to sort of fund their efforts. There's sometimes less resources than, say, against like a FANG company, like a Facebook or a Google, but I feel like the incentives are also different. Like the places that we want to explore are characteristically different, and I think it's important for us to find, again, a way of coexisting in figuring out what are the efforts that we can do in the places that we want to go, that maybe someone that's driven by profits would be less interested in going. That
So
benefits.
what might that look like? Let's explore that a little bit. Like, what could that look like? What would a positive scenario look like in terms of using some combination of open plus AI to enhance education or enhance access to education, if you prefer?
Yeah. So I think that opportunity in this around ways in which we might coordinate these efforts directly with historically marginalized populations. And I think about that in terms of both, like, I can think about that in the US context, and I can think about that in sort of the global context. You probably would have more to say on the global context than I. But I feel like as we think about the efforts that we can sort of put our energy behind, uh, in my mind, it's how do we, upset the dynamics of, going to those that have the capacity to pay for advanced technologies as being the initial beneficiaries. And I think with AI, it's the stakes are a little bit higher. I think maybe I'm mistaken, in part because I think we're still shaping what AI is. We're still in the generative creative phase of artificial intelligence, and I think that if we can get, historically marginalized populations integrated into the shaping of AI from the onset, that could have a tremendous impact and influence on the sort of general benefits of this technology in the future, that likely wouldn't otherwise happen. So if you followed sort of market incentives, then you would effectively go towards populations that can pay for advanced technologies and get their voices included, and get their input and shape the direction of things that then become, from like some idea of like a trickle down benefit to the rest of society, which I'm not 100% sold works out the way that some might advocate that it could. I'll say that, like, I actually see three sort of spaces here, Rob. I see sort of the venture capital market side, I see the academic researcher side, and I see sort of the nonprofit third position. And I feel like when I think of the Open University and the work that you're doing there, I think about that as sort of the academic institution side. And there's also a split initiative on the university system in the publisher parish paradigm of, is this going to be materially novel new knowledge that can, make a contribution on an academic perspective. And that split motivation sometimes is going to guide efforts in university contexts in a particular direction, in parallel to how sort of a venture capitalist market-driven perspective would take. And I think there's a third position of the sort of role of nonprofits in this, that they don't particularly have the same sort of split motivation between sort of academic incentives or market incentives, but they also bring with them their own sort of mission into the work. And so I would say that each nonprofit frequently has some form of a mission statement that their efforts will be, sort of organized around. And those missions are going to help influence a third perspective in the development of AI in education.
So, so one idea that came up then was this idea of openness almost being like a kind of organizational principle for how AI could be rolled out, rather than it being a kind of a capitalist driven model. And the OpenAI, the company, has this tension in its organizational structure, right? At least in the past, they had non-for-profit side and the for-profit side, and the idea was to keep those two things in balance. But what you seem to be saying, as I interpreted it, was the idea that openness is potentially a sort of counterbalance or a different model for how to implement the technology, because then it can lead to it being more inclusive. Like you said before, the relationship between inclusion and openness being sort of necessary but not sufficient. So the same thing would apply here. Is that the idea that you then extend the same kind of concept to the way that technology gets rolled out, and openness is a kind of different form of distribution almost, or a different form of organization?
Yeah, and honestly, I almost feel like openness is more foundational than distribution. I feel like distribution is, if we like let's just talk about open world for a second, right? Like I can step out into the world, it's open, and it's there for me. But the distribution of that is a different effort, right? And so like think about distribution of like openness of the open worlds frequently is like tourism or something, where it's like, how do I bring people here, right? And that can be like market driven. That can be like, hey, we've got these resorts and playgrounds for you to come and explore, come and join us, or these wonderful, and then it can be like academic, like look at all of these wonderful historic markers and sort of heritage sites where we can learn about our culture and our history, and that can be the motivating factor. And I think that when you think about that, and this is actually a really reasonable example of like you can use the market to create spaces that would attract people to come and visit a particular open part of the world, or you can use sort of like learning and heritage as a way to attract people to a different open part of the world. But what I'm arguing is that there are parts of the world that are very difficult to attract people to go to. And so it's those specific places that I feel like there's a role for nonprofits to explore. We should go there, and we should go there based on this sort of mission and this goal. And it might not be a learning goal of heritage, and it might not be a market goal of a theme park, but it might be a goal of just better understanding this region of the world, for it just being just inherently a useful place to be and go and explore. And in my mind is sort of the mission statements of those nonprofits.
So let's imagine that the nonprofit is kind of successful. What would that look like? What does it look like to have kind of equitably distributed AI in education?
So I think that there's a couple of ways that I could see that sort of equitable outcome transpiring. Some of which I think that historically, when we see things like that happen, frequently it's unintentional, and it's sort of like somebody has built something somewhere and it gets repurposed by an under-resourced location to solve a real-world problem that they're facing. And I think that what we likely need to become better at as a society is figuring out like how do we intentionally design springboards of opportunity that benefit people and locations around the world that frequently don't get the attention that is needed to address the real world problems that they're facing. And so I think that success could look like sort of an unintentional, something was designed over here for this group for this very specific reason, and it got repurposed by this other group over here to sort of address a real world challenge that they're facing. And I think the hope that I have is that we can become better at creating sort of the embarrassment of opportunities with our technologies, that it's not through happenstance that it ends up directly benefiting sort of a historically marginalized population, but rather it has been designed up front to have that capacity.
And what kind of utility are we getting out of AI in this sort of scenario?
Okay, so this is exciting in my mind. So I think that when we talk about the utility of AI in education, I think immediately about if we talk about artificial intelligence, and let's just acknowledge that part of artificial intelligence is its capacity for learning, right? So it's taking on these large data sets, it's learning from it, and effectively it should be able to make some strategic decisions around all of the information that's gathered, organized, and sort of made sense of. Or even just made sense of in like a statistical lens or a probability lens or whatever lens it's using to make sense of that information. But it ultimately comes up with some sort of suggestions or recommendations or sort of strategic decisions in specific contexts. And I would say that if we go back to the earlier stages of AI where we were really interested in modeling human intelligence artificially, I would start to ask questions like, what is human intelligence, right? What is, and I've heard some people refer to this. I can't remember where I heard this term, but someone talked about. I want to talk about AI as authentic intelligence. Where's the authentic intelligence in this conversation? And I feel like there's a component to understanding human intelligence that and this is what I feel like is so transformative and key to how we advance, is that with human intelligence we rely on diversities of perspective. We actually would not be successful as a species if we were homogenous in our thinking. So we have lots of different regional perspectives, lots of different nations, lots of different like ways in which we've organized human intelligence into all of these different pockets around the world of different perspectives. And my worry, I guess, with the technology and what this, you asked what would the benefit be, or my worry is that it might become an over homogenizing effect. That like, let's take all of the information on the internet and synthesize all of it, and then like, here's the opinion, and it's like, this is the opinion, and like, and I don't think that we're at high risk of moving in that direction, but I think it's a guardrail that we need to be paying attention to. That we need to foster a range of possibilities that are explored through a multitude of efforts to really be successful from my perspective.
So you've almost sort of outlined a bit of a tension, right? Because on the one hand, there's this possibility of AI lending opportunities for diverse input sort of thing, and including more people in kind of what's happening. But then there's also this potentially homogenizing effect, or a kind of data incursion effect, where everything just kind of gets pureed down to the same kind of slop and everything is gray sort of thing.
Right. And so here's a criticism that I'd like to lay out really quickly, is frequently we argue that we value diversity. We value the diversity of opinion. We value the diversity of our data sets. We value diversity. But if our value system of diversity creates technologies that have homogenizing effects, then what we're really doing is we're actually not valuing diversity. We're trying to reap like a sort of uniform outcome from a rich, diverse set of perspectives. And I think that when you really value diversity, then the technologies that you're making should be generative in that diversity, right? And I can use the example of like the AI work in gameplay, where, you know, AI is like learning how to play Go or learning how to play chess. And I know in the Go world, there are times when the AI makes a move that we wouldn't expect. We wouldn't understand. We don't exactly know why. Like, why did it do that? And to me, that's adding diversity of perspective, right? So based on our current understanding of that game, the move it just made is not something that any of our experts would have suspected as the right next move. So it's generating some diverse opinion here. And so as I think about the relationship between AI and human intelligence, I think about the capacity that it can have to show us additional alternatives that we wouldn't otherwise consider. And I think that's brilliant. And again, the tension is that frequently, you know, when you build these predictors and you know algorithms, they tend to sort of say, okay, here's the recommendation based on all the information that I have. This is what I think you should do. And I think that again, this is where that's kind of how people operate a lot, right? And humanity's intelligence is collective in nature, from my perspective. You actually want a whole bunch of people to arrive at a conclusion of what they think they should do, and you want them to believe that. You want them to sort of be bought into and drive through the large levels of effort that are necessary to pursue the idea that they think is the right path to go down. But then it's the intelligence on a collective level emerges from a range of people taking a range of approaches and seeing like both the intended and unintended consequences of their actions, and reflecting on that and identifying what's the trajectory that we'd like to be headed down, and which of these pursuits led us in a path that's aligned with our goals sort of as a society. And so I feel like there's a level of, if AI is modeled at like the individual intelligence level of identifying what it thinks is the optimal or best approach, then I guess you need a bunch of AIs to make a bunch of ideas of what that optimal approach is to sort of build that collective intelligence component.
So that's interesting stuff. You spoke a bit about the kind of the direction of things, and where we might want to get to. Where do you think things are going to go in reality? What do you think is likely to happen with AI in education, especially with relation to openness, but in general is also fine?
Yeah, so I think if things follow historical patterns, then advances in ed tech frequently become productized and integrated into sort of publishing organizations in which multitudes of data sets and insights are sort of behind the doors of for-profit organizations that they use for continued refinement and improvement of their products. And I think that one thing that's an interesting challenge in this work is that I might be mistaken, I might be speaking out of turn here, but I don't know of many for-profit organizations that are actively seeking to share their data and their insights with their competitors. And I feel like the strength of the development of these technologies kind of rely on access to large quantities of data. And so I feel like, when I say what's the likely outcome, I think that probably the initial moves, sort of maybe siloed insights and products across different publishing agencies with very sort of like target specific uses that meet marketable demands to sort of improve products along specific dimensions that sort of help them sort of sell more product. And it's not a criticism. It's just sort of like how I see market-driven forces operate. I think that what's interesting about this technology is that if we want to realize its potential, I think we need to find another path. And I think we need to find a path that is like underpinned through openness. that will help us to continue to generate, larger data sets across multitudes of contexts and across products, across companies, across organizations, right? Like that are really helping us to better understand uh, what's actually happening in the classroom. Like what's going on during that teaching and learning, and what is it that we can draw as insights from that about what's working and what can be improved, and all of those things, because I feel like we right now don't really, like, right now if you ask me what's going on uh, across, even my school district, like all the students in my own school district, what's going on for all of them right now, like I couldn't answer that question. But I think that we're on the cusp of being able to answer questions like that. And as we're able to answer those, I think that there's productive opportunities there that might be somewhat hindered by existing market forces.
So you've kind of started to talk about the next sort of area, which is around the challenges, and you've got one there, I guess, around information. Not you're talking about people working in silos and stuff like that. Maybe there's an opportunity there as well. There's obviously that challenges are opportunities as well in some ways. How do you kind of understand the sort of the barriers or the challenges that are coming up in terms of implementing AI, either equitably or openly or inclusively, or however you want to see it?
All right, so I think the biggest hurdle that I think we need to find a way or a challenge associated with this work is around ethical data access and privacy, uh, and like, you don't have to go very far to quickly ask questions about that. Like, so for example, if someone, like I was just saying, like there's all this promise and potential if I could tell you about everything that was going on in my school district. I also might have some concerns if the people that had access to all of the data of all the students in my school district were people that I didn't feel were motivated by the sort of learning outcomes and benefits to that population. And so I think that across the globe there are a variety of actors that sort of have different motivations, and not everyone is altruistically motivated to better learning and teaching outcomes in school systems, right? And like for example, if you're not if the all the data in my school district doesn't raise alarm bells, then what about all data across my nation, my country? Or what about all data across all nations and all countries? Like, are you starting to get a little bit uncomfortable if, say, someone said I had access and could tell you about what every third grader is doing around the entire globe right now? Would that raise some concerns for you? And I think it might, particularly depending on who was making the claim that they had access to that level of information. So there's but at the same token, if the person that had access to that was genuinely trying to better understand how to improve the teaching and learning, that would be perceived as a benefit. If that was not their motivation, it would be very much perceived as a risk, and sort of a potentially unethical behavior. And so I think that there's a challenge in that on how do we move forward toward that potential while paying attention to the sort of ethical data privacy, like almost like table stakes for the advancement. And it's interesting because I feel like that's another tension with openness is, what I've just been talking about is almost a motivational access to information. And I think that's a question on openness from my perspective. Like, if you are genuinely open, then everyone has access. It's open, right? It's open. The door's open. Walk right in. But if the person that's walking in is a burglar, like maybe the door shouldn't have been open, right? So I feel like there's a question mark for me on the tensions between openness and motivations of actors that want to have access.
So one way you can kind of frame that is the idea of openness as a kind of anarchy, right? Where it's just like, yeah, the door's open, anyone can come in. Or the idea of openness being a sort of way of having protected spaces, or protected kinds of experiences, rather than just it's a free-for-all. Basically, that's what open means. But I think that tension is there within the open education and other open movements anyway, right? There's that kind of on the one hand wanting to be as free as possible, but also there's this idea of conscience and commitment to social justice and stuff that can pull in a different direction. So yeah, I think those tensions are there. Any more challenges or risks that you wanted to mention?
Yeah, and this is maybe a more nuanced challenge that I'll articulate about teaching and learning in AI. I think this is a yet to be understood whether or not this is a challenge, but let me frame the thought. One of the things that really frustrates the heck out of me is if I'm working on a problem where I don't know the solution. The solution is still unknown, and somebody shouts out the answer. And the reason why that frustrates me is I feel like they just stole my thinking process. I feel like they just undercut my ability to think through the problem for myself. Because once you've seen a solution, you can't unsee it. And I think the way in which like our brains operate against like something where I don't know the answer to something where I do know an answer is different. And so there's a level of where is the thinking taking place? And I use an example about AI and sort of decision making and thinking, in that like I'll think about like just something I've been to a few times is like at an academic conference. And so if I went to an academic conference and at lunchtime someone delivered me my favorite sandwich for lunch, not even my favorite overall, but what I wanted to have that day, I honestly wouldn't care where that problem solving took place. It wouldn't matter to me like who knew that I was going to want a fresh mozzarella cheese sandwich that day. Like who knew? I didn't even know, but like somebody knew and they gave it to me and I was like excited. I don't care where that decision making, where that problem solving took place, because it feels really irrelevant to what I'm there for. And what I'm there for at a conference is to sort of get exposed to new ideas and hear some of the latest research and get into the Q&A sessions and ask some like questions that help me better understand things that I'm just discovering. So if the decision making on what sessions I went to was made up for me, and someone said, okay, here's your schedule for the conference, I'd be a little bit upset. I'd be like, well, wait, why do you think you know what sessions I want to go to? And it could be that it does a better job of picking sessions for me than I would myself. Like that's possible, but I feel like I would lose out on that thinking process. I would lose out on that development and learning internally around how to navigate the sort of the purpose for me being there. And so I feel like there's a tension there. Does that?
Yeah. I mean, it sounds there's a kind of, it's partly like an autonomy angle, but then there's also this idea of like outsourced cognition, and you kind of don't want to lose the benefits of cognition, like by letting someone else do the thinking, as it were, or letting a machine think that bit for you.
Right. And I feel like it's one of those things where like I honestly don't know how much of a concern this is, because it could be that over time we see that places where we can offload the cognition are actually beneficial, and there might be a preference on my part to not offload that cognition on certain things, but that may not be the best path forward in certain circumstances. But I also feel like there's a place where just respecting the personal development that I'd like to have in my life, as part of the evaluation of how we balance places where artificial intelligence can play a role and human intelligence can play a role. In part because there's the reason why I get concerned about this is in education terms, we talk about the concepts of far transfer, where you've sort of learned something in one context and you're able to apply it in a completely different context. And people, I think, do that, I think quite a bit. I think I feel like I have that experience quite a bit of having these principled ideas and understandings in one context that I think about applications of in wildly different places. And I'm not sure that artificial intelligence is going to develop the same level of sort of far transfer that might be a human intelligence thing. Um, and so if we don't develop these sort of dimensions of intelligence across these contexts that maybe a machine could be good at, then we might undercut our ability to sort of do a far transfer to wildly different contexts where that information is practically important, or at least a guiding approach to exploring a really novel situation for which we don't have a lot of understanding. Um, and so I feel like there's going to be some level of, we need to respect the sort of intuition that people may have on areas in which they'd like to have personal learning experiences, because that might be building a comprehensive set of understandings that give them a different way of looking at novel situations.
Thanks. Yeah, interesting stuff. We're coming up to the last 5 minutes now, so we're up to the last question, really. But I guess it's a fairly sort of open-ended question in some ways, and it's really about kind of strategy, and asking what kind of strategies or policies or actions going forward do you think would promote the right kind of openness in AI in education?
So you might be able to predict my answer with your human intelligence, that I think that we need to be far more inclusive in our practices as we advance educational technologies, and AI being one, in which, like, how do we incorporate the range of stakeholders that are the beneficiaries of these technologies into the sort of identification of like how we advance and move forward with AI in education, I think is a critical thing to be in consideration right now. Um, I think that the policies that I'd like to see, uh, you know, something that I'm highly aware of and hasn't actually entered into the conversation right now at this point is the sort of like the downside, the sort of like the destructive aspects of the creation of some of these technologies. That there are components of like environmental impact, of social impact, of sort of like underpaid workforce in some of the work that's going on. And I think that two wrongs don't make a right, I guess, is a component here. And I think that one of the things that I worry about is that we are maybe sometimes making decisions that have sort of negative consequences for portions of our global society of humanity. Um, with the I think maybe some people are making those decisions with the notion that the benefit is maybe outweighing the cost. And I think that historically we've kind of seen overpromise of what AI can do. First off, I don't agree with the argument that, like, the ends justify the means. But secondly, I'm not sold that the ends are going to be as grandiose as some would argue. Uh, we'll see again how time plays out, but I feel like there's a level of as we think about policies, thinking about the ethical creation of these technologies is part of the conversation.
You mentioned earlier in the conversation issues around data and sort of the ethical use of data and kind of respecting privacy and stuff like that. Are there any kind of strategies or policies or activities around that, or any values around that you think we should be abiding by?
I think there's a question that I have on this, Rob, and I'm hopeful that someone else that you interview has an answer to this question.
Okay.
But let me ask this question as a response to your question, and I apologize for doing it this way. But the question that I have is, on a data security and privacy perspective, there's a level of, as I've created some of these platforms that work on generating AI for teaching and learning, One thing that I was exploring was the ability for users to opt out of their data being integrated into the training set. And one of the things that I think is interesting about this sort of opting out question is you can think about opting out of my data going into the technology. You can think about opting out of the technology being a part of my experience, right? Like I could say, like, turn off the predictors for me. I don't want machines predicting my expressions. Don't collect my data. I don't want my data feeding into predictors. I think that there's an interesting challenge in data privacy and security. And I think I heard this from Kristen DeServo talking about Conmigo, that if we protect student data from going into training these models, then our vulnerable populations may never be represented in the data sets that are training the AI. And so there's a challenge or a tension between what is protection and what is exclusion. And then there's a question about whose responsibility is it to ensure the inclusion of perspectives or a range of underrepresented perspectives within these technologies. If these technologies are, run by a for-profit organization, whose responsibility is it to? I'm not saying that no one should include the range of perspectives, but I'm saying that right now it feels like there's not a market particular initiative to make that happen, and there's incentives from a data privacy perspective to prevent that from happening. And then there's the question that I want to ask is, if AI becomes such a powerful tool, will we even be able to choose to opt out from it? Like, is it going to be such a competitive advantage at some point where the choice to not do it is maybe going to put you at a severe disadvantage, or to not integrate with it? And in the example that I actually was talking about this idea with some of my friends back in my 20s, 20 years ago. And it was a question of, like, performance enhancing drugs. I think there's like a parallel between AI and performance enhancing drugs. If every athlete in your sport is using a performance enhancing drug that gives them such a competitive advantage, would you have to use it to play that sport, to be competitive in that sport? And I used to joke, like, if there was a performance enhancing drug that let you, like, play basketball like Charles Barkley, and generate hypotheses like Albert Einstein, would you have a choice? Like, wouldn't like, if by not participating, does that put you on a tracking system of not having equal opportunities for your own future career growth and development? And I think that it's possible that we see AI reach a level of sort of benefit where it may not be a choice. I don't think we're there right now, but my question is that when we reach that point, like, what do we need to think through about that in terms of implications for society on the broader strokes, like these questions of homogenization, these questions of different actors having access to new levels of information with different motivations. I think that there's questions that we need to think through now, in part because we might reach a point where participation may, even if it is flagged as optional or designed as optional, there might be pressures that sort of compel people to participate whether they want to or not.
Okay, that's great. Thanks, Garron. Thank you for your insights in our sharing them during our conversation. There's a bit of space now at the end if you wanted to add anything else that you might have wanted to say, but we didn't cover in our prompts.
I think I'm just super curious to hear the perspectives of all the people you're talking to, and when is this gonna? You said you're going to do something at Open Education World or something like that?
So next month is Open Education Global in Australia, and I'll be there, and V will be there, but Vid won't be there. But the idea is, as we've got a session at the conference where it will really be a kind of like open floor debate, but we're going to show a few clips from this study at the start to kind of just frame it and talk a bit about what we're doing. The actual study itself won't be finished, I think, probably till the new year in terms of just like an analysis and stuff like that. But we've got a good list of people we're interviewing, so that's all worked out really well. It's come together nicely. So yeah, in terms of like, you know, if we're now kind of outside of the interview itself and kind of just chatting and debriefing, as it were, I totally, you know, agree with some of the stuff you're saying around inequality in terms of access. But I've been thinking of it in terms of more like a new digital divide, if you want to put it that way, and saying, look, even if people all get access, you know, because this stuff will be like built into people's mobile phones and stuff like that. But it will be the rich kids who get the good versions, and it'll be the poor kids that get the crappy ones, right? And the poor kids will be the ones whose data is getting harvested all day, right? Because they can't afford to pay for the premium version or whatever. And you know, and you've also got this kind of like hype cycle stuff, over promise, under deliver, just rush to market, try and get, you know, a foothold, and you know, so I think there is a lot of stuff being oversold as well. At the same time, there's, you know, and it's so messy for like assessment. And I was chatting with someone yesterday that was saying that like it looks like use of the GPT software just like spikes during term time, implying that the kids are all using, you know, this kind of stuff to do their assignments and stuff. The adults, you know, not so much, right? And there's a lot of kind of, you know, just, and there's a lot of people who are just maybe like, they're not at a point in their career where they want to learn a new thing like AI. You know, I think there's a lot of resistance, whereas it's becoming sort of normalized for younger people just to kind of at least just know how to use it and how to, you know, get something out of it. I've been finding ChatGPT's got better in the last year or so, and I've found it kind of useful for some things, terrible at some other things. Most of my use cases are not really to do with teaching as such. It's more with like writing or coming up with ideas or, you know, stuff like that. So yeah, so I'm kind of dabbling in this stuff. I've been exploring a bit. Like I tried to write a paper last year where the idea was, okay, so what does the authentically open version of this stuff look like? Because the OpenAI company is not what we would call open, right? It's using the kind of branding of being of calling itself open, but it's not really, you know. And now it's getting rid of its not-for-profit management and all that sort of stuff, right? So in a way, like, you know, plus ça change, you know, it's just like the same stuff kind of happening again with these cycles. But yeah, so I was trying to look at this idea of like what does openness look like in this field, and I started trying to write that paper, and it ended up becoming a paper about explicable AI, really. And really the idea of explicability is one potential dimension of openness or transparency around, you know, algorithms and these kind of things. So at the moment I've got this one I've got this kind of 4 argument paper that I'm working on, where the 4 kind of elements, if you like, that I'm trying to sort of say, okay, this is what the authentically open version might look like. The first one is having this sort of socio-technical perspective. So not just thinking about the technology itself, thinking, does this help me do a particular thing that I'm trying to do in a classroom or wherever, but actually looking at the full like environmental and social impact of this stuff, whereas rather than just saying it's either a useful tool or it's not. One aspect around this explicability and transparency, and sort of saying that maximal explicability should be the goal for any open system, but the idea of explicability is not sufficiently problematized by a lot of the literature. They just kind of go, oh yeah, make it explicable, make it ethical and responsible, without any real detail about that. And in the case of explicability, you've got one idea of explicability, which is sort of saying this is the technically true like description of what's going on in this algorithm or something like that. But that's indecipherable to most people who don't understand algorithms and how they work in machine learning and all the rest of it. So is that explicable? In some ways, it's similar to your openness versus inclusion kind of tension. You say, well, yeah, you've made it explicable, right, to a few people who can understand it, but not to the stakeholders that are actually trying to use it. They need a different kind of explanation for us to be able to call that something explicable. And then the other 2 parts are around, firstly, intellectual property. And you were sort of touching on this towards the end, where I would say, okay, at the moment, what's happening is, you know, people are starting to get interested in using GPTs to create OERs and this kind of stuff, speed up the writing process, maybe do some translation and these kind of things. So some potential uses, but some risks around that, partly from the potential quality of the output, but also around, well, you know, saying, well, hang on a second. The open education movement has for a long time kind of asserted the need for rights over intellectual property and respect for people's copyright, and they just choosing to express it in a different way than the regular copyright model, but it's still an important thing. So now we just endorse this idea of it doesn't matter, we're just going to feed stuff into the machine, and whatever we get out, it's good, we can use that. And at one level it's like, well, you can use that legally at the moment. You can't copyright what comes out of a GPT or whatever, because it has no author in the traditional sense, right? This is the latest judgments in case law in America. It's like, well, okay then, so then this could be like a great kind of crime, right? Because you say, okay, then we're just going to take whatever we want copyrighted, we feed it in one end, and whatever comes out the other end, we're good to go. And so you could say, well, in a way, that's a very subversive approach towards intellectual property that they've managed to like get through. And in a way, it's an extension of some of the freedoms that the open licenses are supposed to give you, but it doesn't come with the protection for intellectual property that the open license does. And so we, at the moment, we need a better solution for that, because you can say, and people are starting to add deeds to Creative Commons, like whether or not you want it to be included in training sets, this kind of stuff. The AI companies don't care what license you put on something. They couldn't care less, right? Yeah. They don't care. It doesn't matter. So then I feel like there's a bit of a distraction happening where people are starting to go, well, what about open licenses? And it's like, they don't care what you do. They're taking it.
And there's something here too that I think has the potential to be paradigm shifting too, Rob, like in that I really love this interview they had with Nick Cave. It was on The Guardian. Did you see that article at all?
I'm not sure. Was it a few months?
I think it was. Yeah, it was maybe a year ago. It was pretty old. But someone had taken Nick Cave's catalog of songs and asked ChatGPT to write a Nick Cave song, and had like tweeted it to him and said, "Oh, here, look, this AI just created a new Nick Cave song." And he looked at it and he was like, that's actually it's actually a bad song. That feels like a derivative work of my catalog. And he was talking about, as an artist, like, I work really hard to not be derivative of my own work.
He's looking for something new each time. Yeah.
I'm always trying to reinvent myself. I'm always trying to break down everything that I've done and come up with a new way of expressing and a new way into songwriting. And the last thing I want to do is create derivatives of my previous work and just sound like an echo of things that I created before. And I feel like what's interesting to me about this generative AI is that on some levels, we have just hit like the hyper accelerator on derivative work. Like we have sort of like created a tap into as much derivative work as we could possibly want. And yet, again, this is where, I think we have to be thinking about the development of technological artificial intelligence and intelligence, because what's fed into that sort of derivative work engine is the sort of novel and interesting ideas that people created. And so we need to make sure that we maintain and protect a process of teaching and learning that helps people to create those new novel discoveries that can sort of add to the capacity for our ability to create more synthesis and derivatives of that new novel idea in conjunction with our current understandings across a range of ideas. And so, I feel like from my perspective, there's this level of how do we think about, like, do we need to be thinking about AI as like a really good engine for derivative work? And if that's what it is, then we don't want the rest of humanity to be derivative, right? We need to be able to create new things and explore new boundaries. And so how do we keep supporting people's development to generate that? I think is of importance. Or maybe we reach a point where machines, it's generative AI, and that it can probabilistically use all of this data set to sort of synthesize across what we've already created. And there's a lot of value in being able to quickly generate that. But also, like, where's the new edge of understanding going to be sort of explored? And is that in technology or is that in people? I like to think that it's in people. Maybe I'm mistaken, but if it's going to be in people, what development do they need to go through to be able to generate that themselves?
Yeah, there's a lot to get your teeth into, that's for sure.
Yeah, but yeah, I mean, this is a fun topic, and explainability or transparency into algorithms, like interpretability. I actually think about that in parallels to human intuition. That there are times when people make decisions and take actions for which they can't explain themselves. And there are times when machines will take actions and make predictions for which it's difficult to interpret why it's drawing that conclusion. And I don't like to undervalue human intuition, and therefore I don't like to undervalue what I see as sort of a parallel machine intuition. But from my perspective, there's times where maybe we don't yet have as comprehensive of an understanding to surface and explain the direction that we'd like to go in, or think what is the right next logical step. And so while intuition is potentially beneficial in those places where our level of understanding is insufficient, that needs to be followed with surfacing the underpinnings of that intuition, and building a better understanding as to why that works. So like when the AlphaGo makes a move that you don't expect, you're like, but why? Right? But why? What is it doing? What is it thinking that, or what's it got that we don't know? What's right? And so I feel like, there's value to unexplainable ways forward, both on the human intelligence and the artificial intelligence side. But I think that generates the question of exploration to surface the why behind it in both cases.
Yeah, there's certainly other ways of looking at it, and it may be that explicability is not the thing from a pedagogical point of view, but my question is more, what does openness look like in this context? How do we apply the same values in this context? And just trying to sort of just articulate and explore that, really.
Okay, talk to you later.
All right, take
Bye.
it easy. Bye.